The freight wagon lay twisted in the dusty gully like a dying beast, its wooden frame splintered and cargo scattered across the hardpan under the merciless August sun. Amélie Rousseau pressed herself against the wagon's underside, clutching a leather satchel to her chest as if it held her very soul. The wheel had snapped clean during the morning's journey to Willow Springs, sending the wagon tumbling down the embankment in a crash that still rang in her ears. Her father's final words echoed in her mind as she lay hidden among the wreckage. The music box, child. When trouble comes, remember the music box. At 18, Amélie had thought the ornate little treasure from her New Orleans childhood an odd thing for a dying prospector to mention. But Lucienne Rousseau had been specific about many strange things in those final fevered days. The memory came unbidden herself at 7 years old, sitting on her father's lap in their cramped cabin, while fever ravaged his lungs. He'd produced the music box with trembling hands, its mother-of-pearl surface catching candlelight like captured stars. When he wound the tiny key, it had played an old Creole lullaby that her maman used to hum while braiding Amélie's hair before consumption claimed her too. This song, her father had whispered, his voice barely audible above the delicate melody. Your maman sang it the night you were born. Said it would keep you safe when we couldn't. He'd pressed the box into her small hands with desperate tenderness. Promise me, petite. Promise you'll remember. She'd promised, though. She'd never understood why a simple music box seemed more important to him than gold claims or mining equipment. Now clutching documents that had already cost men their lives, she was beginning to comprehend her father's desperate foresight. 3 riders approached through the heat shimmer, their horses' hooves drumming a funeral march against the baked earth. The lead rider sat his saddle with predatory grace, Conrad Dietrich, owner of the Copper Crown mine, his silver-trimmed boots and fine hat speaking of wealth extracted from both earth and human misery. Behind him rode Greasy Pete and Rattler men, whose reputations preceded them like the stench of carrion. Well now, Conrad drawled, his voice smooth as silk over steel. Appears someone's having difficulties. Through a gap in the wagon's broken boards, Amélie watched Conrad dismount with fluid precision. These men had been trailing her since Sable Junction, asking questions about documents that supposedly belonged to the mining company. Her father had been careful with his papers, always talking about proper registration with the land office. But when he died on August 23rd, his cabin had been ransacked before she could even arrange burial. Search it thorough, Conrad ordered, chewing thoughtfully on a matchstick. Greasy Pete's boots crunched on broken glass as he circled the wreckage. Ain't nobody here, boss. Just scattered goods and... He paused, tilting his head. Wait, I smell French soap. The kind fancy ladies use. Amélie's heart hammered against her ribs. The satchel contained her father's most important papers, though she'd never understood why he'd been so secretive about a mining claim that barely paid expenses. Now, as Rattler fired a warning shot that cracked like thunder across the empty grassland, she was beginning to suspect that her father's worthless claim might be worth killing for. That's when she heard it, the whisper of grass parting so soft it might have been wind. But 3 days of running had taught her to distinguish between nature's sounds and human approach. From the brush along the gully's edge, a figure emerged like smoke given form. Tall and lean, with black hair catching the dying light and skin bronzed by countless seasons under open sky, he carried a Winchester 1873 rifle with casual competence. His dark eyes fixed on Conrad's men with the intensity of a predator marking prey. Bodaway had been tracking these men for days, following their trail from Copper Gulch, where his uncle Seganam had died exactly 1 year ago, under circumstances that still burned in his chest. The official report blamed renegade warriors, but Bodaway knew lies when he smelled them. He'd come seeking answers, and perhaps Providence had delivered them in the form of this overturned wagon, and the terrified girl hiding beneath it. As he watched the white men circle like vultures, Bodaway felt the familiar war between his uncle's teachings and the rage that had driven him across 3 territories seeking justice. Seganam had preached patience, understanding the long view that saw beyond immediate anger toward lasting peace. "Vengeance is a circle, nephew," the old man had often said while they sat by evening fires. "It goes round and round, feeding on itself until it devours everything good." But watching these predators hunt an innocent girl, Bodaway struggled to honor that wisdom when swift violence seemed the only language they understood. "It's far enough, Dietrich Bodaway," called out his voice, carrying quiet authority across the space between them. Conrad's hand moved toward his coat but froze when Bodaway's rifle shifted almost imperceptibly. "Well, if it isn't our noble savage. Come to rescue another lost lamb. Leave the girl, right away. We'll call it even." Greasy Pete spat into the dust. 3 against 1 Indian. Them ain't good odds for you. Bodaway's smile held no warmth. "Depends how you count." The shot came sharp and clean. Greasy Pete spun from his saddle with a cry of pain, his shoulder blooming red as he hit the ground hard. Bodaway had already levered another round the metallic sound, cutting through Rattler's curse of surprise. "Move," Bodaway said to the shadows beneath the wagon. Amelie didn't hesitate. She rolled from her hiding place and sprinted toward the Lakota warrior, her heavy skirts tangling around her legs, while the precious satchel bounced against her hip. Behind them, Conrad's voice rose in cold fury as hoofbeats thundered in pursuit. Bodaway caught her hand, his grip strong and sure. "This way, run and don't look back." They plunged into tall grass as the first evening shadows began to stretch across the land. Behind them, Conrad Dietrich watched from his saddle, pale eyes, reflecting the dying light like chips of winter ice. "Bring me that girl," he said to Rattler, who was helping Pete bind his wounded shoulder. "The land office man arrives September 1st. I want this settled before then." From the ridge overlooking Willow Springs, the town spread below them, like a wound in the prairie darkness. Amelie crouched beside Bodaway in the shelter of wind-carved sandstone, studying the settlement that would either offer sanctuary or become their tomb. Even in full darkness, Conrad's influence was visible. Armed men patrolled the main street with military precision, their lanterns casting moving pools of yellow light that turned ordinary storefronts into potential ambush points. The saloons that should have been raucous with evening revelry sat nearly empty, their batwing doors hanging still in air that carried the weight of enforced quiet. 6 men on patrol, Bodaway murmured, pointing to distant figures. 2 more watching the sheriff's office, another pair covering the road north toward the mining camp. Amelie watched a family hurry across the street, the father glancing nervously over his shoulder, while his wife clutched their children close. They disappeared into a modest house, and she could see lamplight being hastily extinguished behind drawn curtains. "They're afraid," she whispered. "Fear is Conrad's greatest weapon." Bodaway replied, his voice carrying the bitter knowledge of someone who'd seen such tactics before. "It costs nothing to maintain, but keeps everyone in line. A few public examples of what happens to troublemakers, and the entire town polices itself." As if to prove his point, one of the patrol riders stopped before the modest frame building that served as the town's church. The man dismounted, walked to the door, and tried the handle with casual presumption. Finding it locked, he rapped sharply with his rifle butt until Reverend Matthews appeared hastily dressed and clearly roused from sleep. Even at this distance, they could see the minister's submissive posture as the rider spoke. Matthews nodded repeatedly, hands wringing in obvious distress before the gunman remounted and continued his circuit. What kind of man turns a house of God into another outpost of his empire? Amelie asked, though she already knew the answer. The kind who understands that controlling souls is more effective than controlling bodies. Bodaway answered, "My people have seen it before. Break the spirit and flesh follows without resistance." They watched for another hour, cataloging patrol routes and noting which buildings remained lit past reasonable hours of the doctor's clinic, the schoolhouse where Ruth Morrison often worked, late preparing lessons, the modest boarding house where traveling merchants stayed. These would be their potential allies, people whose lights burned despite Conrad's preference for darkness. But it was what they didn't see that proved most telling. No children played in evening streets that should have echoed with laughter. No couples strolled hand in hand past shops whose windows should have glowed with welcoming light. No old men gathered on porches to share tales and tobacco while night settled around them. Willow Springs had become a town that held its breath, waiting for permission to live. "There," Bodaway said, indicating the feed store where Walter Kowalski's wagon sat beside stacks of grain sacks. "That man has the look of someone who remembers when this place was different." Amelie followed his gaze, seeing what the warrior's trained eyes had noted, how Kowalski moved with the careful alertness of someone accustomed to watching for threats, how he positioned his wagon for quick escape, how his hand rested near the rifle propped beside his store's entrance. "He's one of the few who hasn't bent the knee completely," she observed. As they prepared to descend toward town, Amelie felt the weight of her father's satchel and thought again of the music box hidden in his cabin. Whatever secrets Lucien had died protecting, they were worth enough for Conrad to turn an entire community into his personal kingdom of fear. The abandoned hay barn on Willow Springs' outskirts offered shelter from both weather and watching eyes. Bodaway had chosen it carefully, multiple exits, clear sight lines, and close enough to town for supplies, but far enough to avoid unwanted visitors. He spread his buffalo hide across the straw-covered floor, the rich fur still carrying the sacred scent of sage smoke from ceremonies that seemed increasingly distant from this harsh frontier reality. From his parfleche bag, he carefully withdrew an eagle feather bonnet, his uncle Seganam's most treasured possession, each feather earned through acts of courage that would live forever in Lakota memory. Amelie sat on the hide's edge, her traveling dress torn and dust-stained dark hair escaping its pins in rebellious curls. She watched Bodaway tend to graze on his forearm with practiced efficiency, his movements speaking of long acquaintance with violence and its aftermath. "You don't have to help me," she said, her voice carrying traces of French Louisiana softened by years in mining camps. "I can find my own way come morning." Bodaway glanced at her, noting the stubborn set of her jaw and how she clutched the satchel like armor. "In the dark, with Dietrich's men hunting you." He shook his head. "You'd be dead before moonrise." "Perhaps, but that would be my choice." He paused, recognizing something in her tone that he'd heard in his own voice during the months after Seganam's death, said the bitter pride of someone who'd learned the world offered no guarantees beyond what you could fight for and hold. "Tell me why they want you," he said, settling against his saddle. From a small pouch he withdrew willow bark and began brewing tea over a carefully shielded fire. Amelie was quiet, watching flames dance, while thinking of other fires, other conversations with her father in those final weeks before consumption claimed him. "My father was Lucien Rousseau. He worked Claim 27 up at Copper Gulch until he died 3 weeks past. The doctor called it natural causes, but you think different." "I think Conrad Dietrich killed him." The words rushed out like water through a broken dam. "Papa was always careful with his documentation, always talking about proper registration with the land office. Said a man's claim was only as good as the law backing it. But when he died, his papers were scattered, and Conrad's men came asking about documents Papa supposedly had." She paused, lost in memory. "The night before he died, Papa made me promise to take his music box to safety if anything happened. Said it would protect me when he couldn't. I thought he was just fevered, seeing things that weren't there. But when I went back to the cabin after his burial, everything had been torn apart. Everything except... She touched the satchel. Except these papers he'd hidden so carefully. Bodaway handed her the bitter tea, considering her words. His uncle Seganam had spoken often of white men's papers and their strange power to grant or deny ownership of land that had belonged to his people for countless generations. What kind of documents? I don't rightly know. Papa never said exactly. She sipped the tea, wincing at its bitterness. But he hid this satchel before he got too sick to leave his bed. Told me to take it to the land office representative when he comes through on his circuit. Said there were people in town who'd helped Dr. Morrison Ruth, the school teacher, others who were tired of Conrad's ways. My uncle died near Copper Gulch, Bodaway said quietly. 1 year ago yesterday. The sheriff blamed renegade warriors, but Seganam sought peace, not war. He was asking questions about mining claims on tribal land, questions that might have led to uncomfortable answers. Understanding flickered in Amelie's eyes. You think Conrad... I think Conrad Dietrich removes obstacles. My uncle was becoming one. His voice carried the weight of mountains. Same as your father. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by wind through the barn's gaps and distant thunder. Neither slept easily, both hearing riders pass in the darkness, patient as wolves, but far more dangerous. Ruth Morrison had never been a woman to wait for events to overtake her. While Amelie and Bodaway sheltered in the abandoned barn, the schoolteacher was conducting her own form of warfare through careful conversations and strategic intelligence gathering. The knock on her door came well past decent hours, but Ruth had been expecting it. She opened to find Henrik Muller standing on her porch, the German immigrant's face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Miss Morrison, he said in accented English, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Forgive the late hour, but I must speak with you about my boy Johann. Ruth stepped aside to let him enter, noting how he moved with the careful alertness of prey animals. Of course, Henrik. What troubles you? Inside her modest parlor, surrounded by books and lesson plans, Henrik Mueller looked like a man bearing an impossible weight. Johann comes home from the mine with stories. Disturbing stories about what he sees in the Copper Crown workings. Ruth poured tea with steady hands, though her pulse quickened. Johann Miller was 15, old enough for dangerous work, but young enough to still possess the moral clarity that adults often compromised away. What kind of stories? She asked carefully. Henrik accepted the cup with trembling fingers. Safety violations that would shut down any legitimate operation. Workers injured and denied medical care. Men who asked questions about pay shortfalls disappearing. And the mine records, Miss Morrison. Johann has seen the real books, not the sanitized versions shown to territorial inspectors. Ruth's mind raced through implications. If Conrad was keeping double books, it suggested systematic fraud on a scale that could topple his entire empire. Your boy is in danger, Henrik. If Conrad suspects he's talking... I know. Henrik's voice cracked with a father's fear. But Johann says there are others. Workers who remember when mining was honest labor instead of theft disguised as commerce. Men who would testify if they thought federal authorities would protect them. This was the moment Ruth had been preparing for, not just hiding fugitives, but building a network of resistance that could challenge Conrad's stranglehold on their community. She rose, moving to a bookshelf, where a hollowed-out volume of Shakespeare concealed her most sensitive correspondence. There are people working to change things, she said carefully. Federal marshals who take reports of corruption seriously. Territorial officials who aren't in Conrad's pocket. But it requires courage and evidence that can't be dismissed or destroyed. Henrik nodded with grim understanding. Johann says he can get access to the real ledgers. Copying would be dangerous, but possible. No. Ruth's voice carried teacherly authority that had quieted countless unruly classrooms. Too dangerous for a boy. But if he could tell us where they're kept when they might be accessible. She pulled a sheet of paper from her correspondence file, revealing a coded message she'd been composing. I have contacts in Denver, people who can get information to federal authorities through channels Conrad can't monitor or bribe. But we need solid evidence, not just testimony that can be dismissed as disgruntled workers making accusations. As Henrik prepared to leave, Ruth pressed a small cloth bundle into his hands. For Johann. Tell him it's from his teacher, but don't let anyone else see it. Inside the bundle was a small revolver, well-maintained, and loaded along with a note written in Ruth's precise script. Sometimes learning requires more than books. Be careful, be brave, and remember that knowledge is only powerful when it reaches those who can act on it. After Henrik departed, Ruth returned to her desk, where lesson plans competed for space with revolutionary correspondence. She was building more than an education for frontier children. She was constructing the foundation of Conrad's downfall, one careful alliance at a time. Dawn came gray and sullen, bringing with it the sound Bodaway had been dreading, the careful creak of leather and metal that meant armed men moving with purpose. They're coming, he said without looking at Amelie's hands, already checking his Winchester. 3 riders moving quiet through the grass. Through a gap in the barn's weathered wall, Amelie could see them approaching Greasy Pete with his arm in a sling. Rattler, easy in his saddle, and a third man she didn't recognize, lean and hungry-looking, with eyes that missed nothing. The barn door exploded inward as Pete drove his rifle butt through weathered wood. Morning light streamed through the gap like a sword blade, while splinters showered down around them. "Morning, folks," Pete called with false cheer. "Hope we ain't interrupting nothing important." Amelie threw herself flat as the first shot rang out the bullet-chewing splinters from the beam above her head. The lantern toppled from its hook oil, spilling across dry straw that caught fire with a hungry whoosh. Bodaway's Winchester spoke twice, careful and measured. Through smoke and flame, Amelie heard a horse scream and a man curse creatively. The new gunman had caught lead in his thigh and was fighting his panicked mount. "A water bucket!" Bodaway shouted. Amelie grabbed the wooden pail and flung its contents across the spreading flames. Fire hissed, but didn't die entirely, small tongues still licking at scattered straw. More shots punched through the barn's walls as Rattler circled the building, spurs jangling with each step. "Back door," Bodaway said, grabbing her hand. "Now." They burst into gray morning light, sprinting toward the old corral as the barn groaned behind them. Pete kicked the door fully open with enough force to rattle the structure. "There they go! Don't let that girl escape!" Amelie's skirts tangled as she ran, the satchel bouncing against her hip while bullets whined overhead. They reached the fence as Rattler appeared around the barn's corner, Colt gleaming in his hand. Bodaway vaulted the rails and helped Amelie over her dress, tearing on splintered wood. "Stay low, move fast, and don't let go of that bag," he instructed. "Those papers are keeping you alive." As they ran toward a stand of cottonwoods marking a seasonal creek, Amelie wondered what her father had hidden that was worth killing for. She was about to discover that some secrets carried a price measured in blood. The Rattlesnake Saloon squatted on Willow Springs' main street, like a carbuncle on respectability's face, its bat-wing doors hanging askew and windows clouded with accumulated grime. 3 hours after their escape, Amelie's careful anonymity finally crumbled. "No, well, I'll be hornswoggled," declared a voice like broken glass. "That there's Lucian's girl sure as Sunday follows Saturday." The speaker was Jasper Cobb, a rail-thin prospector, whose played-out claim had driven him to convert whiskey into bitter memories. His bloodshot eyes were sharp when it came to recognizing faces that might be worth something. Amelie froze in the doorway, hand tightening on the satchel. Around her, conversations died as men turned to stare with calculating interest. "Now that's right," Jasper continued, warming to his subject. "Little French gal from Copper Gulch. Her daddy was always poking around mining claims, asking questions about deeds and registrations. Real careful with his papers, Lucian was." Before Amelie could retreat, heavy footsteps echoed on the boardwalk. Deputy Claude Brennan appeared, his tin star catching morning light and hand resting casually on his service revolver. Claude was a man of 35, caught between honest nature and financial obligations that tied him to Conrad's web like a fly to spider silk. But there was something else in his weathered face, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of old pain carefully hidden, and the slight tremor in his hands that suggested the weight of his badge had grown heavier with each compromised choice. "Miss Rousseau," he said, voice carrying false warmth. "Sheriff wants a word. Just routine questions about your father's passing." Amelie's mouth went dry. She'd heard enough about Sheriff Bramwell's interrogation methods to know his idea of routine questions often left people with broken bones and convenient memory lapses. "I haven't done anything wrong, Deputy." "Course not. Sheriff just wants to clear up some confusion." Claude's smile was all teeth and no warmth, but Amelie caught something else in his expression, a flicker of what might have been regret, quickly suppressed. "Nothing to worry about, I'm sure." Bodaway stepped forward so silent, Amelie had forgotten his presence. Several saloon patrons shifted nervously, recognizing dangerous ground when they saw it. "The lady hasn't committed any crimes," Bodaway said quietly. Claude's hand moved closer to his gun, but the motion seemed reluctant, performed from habit rather than conviction. "That's for Sheriff Bramwell to decide. And you're the one causing trouble for Mr. Dietrich's men. Assault disturbing the peace, quite a list building up." The walk to jail took them past Walter Kowalski's feed store, where the Polish immigrant was loading grain with mechanical precision, past the schoolhouse, where Ruth Morrison watched through her window with worried eyes. Word traveled fast in small towns, carried on wings of gossip and speculation. The jail was squat stone designed for drunks and petty thieves, but solid enough to hold anyone Sheriff Bramwell wanted contained. When the heavy door closed behind them, Amelie felt those stones settling around her like a tomb. Sheriff Bramwell waited in his office, a thick-set man whose belly hung over his gun belt and whose eyes held the flat emptiness of someone who'd stopped caring about right and wrong years ago. But it was the other occupant who made Amelie's blood turn to ice water. Conrad Dietrich sat behind the sheriff's desk as if he owned it, which, given frontier politics, he probably did. His expensive suit was immaculate despite the morning's violence, and his pale eyes fixed on Amelie with predatory intensity. "Miss Rousseau," he said, voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "Please sit down. We have much to discuss." Amelie remained standing, chin raised in defiance her father would have recognized and approved. "I have nothing to say to you." "Oh, but I think you do. There seems to be confusion about certain documents that belong to your father. Company property that was removed from his cabin after his unfortunate natural death." "You killed him." The words came out stark and accusatory. The room went silent. Even Sheriff Bramwell stopped chewing his tobacco. Claude's face went pale, his hand trembling as he gripped his pencil with enough force to snap it. Conrad's smile was thin as a razor blade. That's a serious accusation, my dear. The kind that could get a person into considerable trouble. Your father died of consumption, as certified by Dr. Morrison. Natural causes witnessed and documented. Natural causes that came mighty convenient for your business. Bodaway observed his voice carrying quiet authority. Conrad's pale eyes shifted to the warrior. And you would be the savage, interfering with my operations. Sheriff, I believe this man should be charged with assault, theft, and conspiracy to defraud a legally registered mining company. Before Bramwell could respond, the office door burst open with enough force to rattle windows. Dr. Edwin Morrison stood there, medical bag in one hand and righteous anger flushing his weathered face. What in blazes is going on here? He demanded. Claude Brennan, you get these people out of this jail this instant. Edwin was approaching 50, his hair gray at the temples, but his back straight and his voice carrying the authority of someone who delivered half the county's babies and patched up the other half after they'd grown old enough for trouble. But there was something else in his bearing now, a deeper anger that spoke of personal stakes beyond professional duty. The now Doc Sheriff Bramwell began, "This is official business." Official business, my foot. Edwin's voice cut through excuses like a scalpel. If you want to question Miss Rousseau, you'll do it in my office with proper supervision, not in some back room with that snake Dietrich pulling strings. As he spoke, Edwin's eyes found Claude's, and something passed between them, understanding perhaps, or shared memory, of what Willow Springs had been before Conrad's influence poisoned it. The deputy looked away, first shame coloring his features, as he stared at bank notices scattered across his desk. There was another family. Edwin said suddenly, his voice cutting through tension like winter wind. The Kowalsacks worked Dietrich's mine until cave-ins took the father and eldest son. Preventable deaths if safety regulations had been followed. I treated the survivor's widow and 3 children, all coughing blood from silica dust. Nothing I could do for them except ease their passing. He stepped closer to Conrad Medical Authority, giving weight to his words. I signed their death certificates, natural causes, because that's what the law required. But I know murder when I see it. Slow murder, legal murder, but murder nonetheless. For a moment, balance hung in the air like smoke. Then Conrad stood, movements fluid and controlled, but his pale eyes promised retribution. Of course, Doctor. We're all civilized men here. His smile never wavered, but his eyes promised retribution. Miss Rousseau, do consider my offer carefully. The Copper Crown Company is always willing to compensate former employees' families. Generously, even. As they left, Emily caught sight of Claude staring at papers on his desk, bank notices from what she could see, his hands shaking like a man with fever. That evening, she began to understand the true scope of Conrad's power over Willow Springs. It wasn't just about mining claims, but a web of debt and fear that bound good people to evil purposes through the simple mathematics that made resistance more costly than compliance. But understanding the web and escaping it were different propositions entirely. The next several days blurred past in constant motion and mounting tension. Word spread that the land office representative would arrive September 1st, and Conrad's desperation began showing in increasingly bold moves. Ruth Morrison hid them in the schoolhouse, pushing desks aside to create concealment. The schoolmarm was 30-odd years unmarried by choice, with steel-gray eyes and a backbone forged from prairie oak. Children been asking about the Indian, she said, spreading blankets on the floor. Some are scared, but little Mary Kowalski says you fixed her broken slate yesterday. Bodaway nodded. He'd shown the shy girl how to bind cracks with sinew and wood glue, a simple repair that earned cautious acceptance from children who judged by actions rather than skin color. Children see truth clearer than adults. He observed accepting real coffee rather than chicory substitute. They judge by deeds, not by what their parents' fears tell them. Ruth set down her cup, studying Bodaway, with teacher's eyes that missed little. Mary told her father about the kindness. Walter Kowalski is a good man, but he's been careful since his wife died. Afraid to stand out, afraid to give Conrad reason to notice his family. But his daughter's innocent faith in you has him thinking different thoughts. The implications hung heavy in evening air. If Conrad's empire was to fall, it would require more than federal intervention. It would need ordinary people finding courage to stand witness to truth. That night, by shielded lantern light, they finally opened Lucian's satchel with reverence, do something that had already cost lives. Dr. Morrison arrived after dark, having walked the long way to avoid watchers. His steady hands used a penknife to slit the leather binding that sealed the satchel's main compartment. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were documents that made Amelie's breath catch. A co-ownership contract signed by her father and someone named Seganam, establishing joint claim to land designated as Claim 27. The second signature was in English letters, but beneath it was drawn a pictograph, an eagle with outstretched wings. "That's my uncle's mark," Bodaway said quietly. "Seganam, he flies high in our language." But the contract was only the beginning. Beneath lay a ledger covered with Lucian's precise notations, dates, weights, assay results, and payments documenting systematic theft on a breathtaking scale. CD. Dr. Morrison read aloud. Conrad Dietrich. These are records of payments to the Copper Crown Company for ore extracted from Claim 27. But if your father and Seganam owned it jointly, then Dietrich was stealing. Amelie finished, fury and understanding flooding through her. Papa was documenting the theft, every ounce taken illegally. Ruth leaned closer, her teacher's instincts recognizing proper documentation. This ledger goes back 2 years. If these figures are accurate, Conrad's extracted ore worth thousands from land he doesn't legally own. But there was more. Edwin's weathered fingers discovered additional papers folded beneath the ledger correspondence between Lucian and territorial officials, carbon copies of reports, filed with mining inspectors' testimony from workers who'd witnessed unsafe conditions and fraudulent practices. Your father wasn't just keeping records. Edwin breathed with growing amazement. He was building a legal case. This is enough evidence to convict Conrad of fraud, theft, conspiracy, and negligent homicide. The implications staggered them. Bodaway's face was stone, but fire burned in his dark eyes. My uncle died asking questions about white men's mining on tribal land. Questions Conrad couldn't allow answered. If we can get these to the land office representative, Dr. Morrison said gravely, it will expose systematic fraud on a massive scale. Federal crime brings federal justice regardless of local corruption. But their hopes proved short-lived. The next morning brought news that chilled them to the bone. Walter Kowalski burst in just after dawn, his face ashen and work-hardened hands shaking. The Polish farmer was a good man, whose stubborn determination had carved a life from unforgiving soil, and his distress was immediately obvious. "They took my boys," he gasped, accent thick with stress. "Dietrich's men came in the night, said they'd be returned when I told them where you were hiding." His voice cracked with a father's pain. His sons, 10 and 12 years old, were everything to him since his wife's death 2 years past. "Where Boone?" Bodaway asked, warrior instincts already calculating rescue possibilities. "The old Miller place 3 miles north. Burned out homestead with good views of the road. They can see anyone coming for miles." Ruth was already gathering supplies with practiced efficiency. "We'll get them back, Walter, but we need to move fast." As they prepared to leave, Amelie made a crucial decision. She took the most important documents, the contract and key ledger pages, and sewed them into her dress lining using Ruth's needle and thread. The rest she left with Dr. Morrison, trusting his medical reputation to protect evidence until they returned. "If something happens to us," she told the doctor, "make sure these reach the land office. Promise me justice will be done." Edwin's weathered face was grim as he nodded. "I promise, child. But be careful. Desperate men do desperate things." They rode out under threatening skies, following wagon tracks through grass that whispered secrets about armed men and terrified children. The Miller place had been abandoned since drought and debt drove the family east, but stone foundations remained solid and the old well still held water. As they approached through inadequate cover, Bodaway raised his hand for silence. Through heat shimmer, they could see smoke rising, not cooking fire smoke, but the thick black smoke of wood soaked in kerosene and deliberately ignited. "They're destroying evidence," Ruth whispered. But as they crept closer, Amelie realized with growing horror that evidence wasn't the only thing burning. Through wavering heat, she could see two small figures tied to posts near the foundation, Walter's boys terrorized, but alive with flames creeping steadily closer. The trap was set with diabolic precision, and there was no choice but to spring it. What followed would be seared into memory forever. Walter hadn't come alone. 3 neighbors had joined him, farmers who understood that children's lives mattered more than personal safety. They'd planned a simple rescue approach from different directions, overwhelmed the guards through numbers and righteous fury. But Conrad's men were professionals, not the local toughs they'd expected. The ambush was perfectly executed. The first farmer, Henrik Mueller, died before he could fire a shot, Rattler's bullet taking him center mass as he tried to flank the guards. The second, old Tom Bradley, made it closer before Greasy Pete's sawed-off shotgun cut him down in a spray of blood and buckshot that painted the ground crimson. Walter himself charged forward with desperate courage, his Spencer rifle spitting fire as he tried to reach his boys. He made it halfway before multiple bullets found him, shoulder, leg, chest, spinning him to the ground, where he lay gasping in the dust while his children screamed for their father. "Papa," the younger boy's cry cut through gunsmoke like a blade, high and desperate and full of anguish that aged souls beyond their years. Dr. Morrison's buckboard came thundering up the lane, the physician leaping down while his wagon was still moving. Ruth was with him, having insisted on coming despite obvious danger. "Let me through," Edwin shouted, running toward Walter's fallen form. "I'm a doctor." Rattler swung his revolver toward the approaching physician. "Stay back, Doc. This ain't your concern." "A wounded man is always my concern," Edwin replied, his voice carrying 3 decades of frontier medicine's authority. "You want him to bleed to death in front of his children." For a moment, the tableau held Pete with his gun on the terrorized boy's Rattler, covering the doctor and flames consuming everything Walter had worked years to build. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of burning flesh from trapped animals' heat, making the afternoon shimmer with nightmare visions. In the pause, Greasy Pete found himself staring at the 2 children, tied to the posts, their faces streaked with tears and soot. Something flickered across his weathered features. Not conscience exactly, but perhaps a memory of his own childhood before war and whiskey had carved away whatever softness he'd once possessed. "Jesus," he muttered, voice barely audible. "They're just kids. This ain't what I signed up for." Rattler heard him and snarled. "You signed up for whatever Mr. Dietrich pays you for. Don't go getting soft now." "Ain't soft," Pete replied, but his grip on the shotgun had loosened slightly. "Just saying there's ways to make a point without..." His words trailed off as he caught sight of the younger boy's face, maybe 8 years old, with wide blue eyes that held terror, but also a stubborn defiance that reminded Pete of himself at that age, before his father's fists had beaten idealism into submission. That's when Amelie saw her chance. While the gunmen focused on each other with predatory concentration, she crept toward the barn's rear, where an old water trough sat in shadow. The oak container held perhaps 50 gallons, fed by a hand pump drawing from Walter's well. She had no plan beyond creating distraction, but sometimes desperation proved more effective than strategy. Grabbing the pump handle, she began working it frantically, sending water cascading over the trough's edge in a silver stream that reflected firelight. The splashing carried clearly, despite crackling flames and distant animal cries. Rattler heard it and turned gun-seeking targets in shifting shadows. "There she is, Pete, the girl's trying." His words were cut by Bodaway's Winchester, the bullet taking Rattler in the shoulder and spinning him around hard enough to send his Colt flying into darkness. But the shot announced Bodaway's position, and Pete responded by pressing his gun barrel against the younger boy's head. "Come out, Indian," Pete yelled toward concealing shadows. "Come out now, or this kid's brains decorate his daddy's yard." Bodaway emerged with rifle at his side and hands visible, moving with careful control. In firelight, his face was carved stone, but calculation burned in his dark eyes as he measured distances and possibilities. Inside his chest, the old war raged again, Seganam's voice, counseling patience and wisdom against the burning desire to end this confrontation with swift violence. His uncle had always said that hatred was a poison that destroyed the vessel containing it, but watching Pete threaten an innocent child tested every principle of peaceful resistance the old man had taught. "Let the children go," he said quietly. "Your fight's with me, not with boys who never harmed anyone." "My fight's with anyone who crosses Mr. Dietrich," Pete replied, voice thick with pain and whiskey-fueled bravado. "You cost me my shooting arm, Redskin. Time to pay with interest." That's when Walter stirred from unconsciousness, the Polish farmer's determination overcoming blood loss and shock. With enormous effort, he reached inside his coat and withdrew something that glinted in firelight, a derringer, small and easily concealed, probably his wife's before consumption claimed her. Walter's voice was barely a whisper, but carried clearly in sudden quiet. "Get away from my boys." Pete turned toward the sound, attention diverted for the crucial moment Bodaway had been waiting for. The warrior's bone-handled knife flashed through firelit air, spinning end over end with deadly accuracy. The blade took Pete in the wrist, severing tendons with surgical precision. His scream echoed across the farmyard as his gun fell from nerveless fingers, but victory proved short-lived. More riders appeared at the firelight's edge, Conrad Dietrich himself on a magnificent black stallion, flanked by 2 professional killers whose faces Amelie didn't recognize. These weren't local thugs, but specialists imported for work requiring steady nerves and accurate shooting. "Touching scene," Conrad drawled voice, carrying false appreciation across the farmyard. "But playtime's over. We have business before federal authorities complicate matters." Deputy Claude Brennan rode up beside his employer, tin star glinting and face pale with sickness. In his trembling hands was a leather satchel that made Amelie's heart sink. "Found this at the schoolhouse," Claude said, voice barely audible. "Just like you said, Mr. Dietrich." But as Conrad examined the satchel's contents by firelight, his expression changed from triumph to confusion, then cold fury. "These are copies," he said, voice deadly quiet. "Clever mice made copies and hid the originals elsewhere." His pale eyes fixed on Amelie with serpentine intensity. "Where are the real papers, my dear?" "Safe," she replied, surprised by her voice's steadiness. safe where federal authorities will find them. Conrad's smile was winter claiming the earth. We'll see about that. He nodded to his killers, and they began closing in with methodical precision. But Conrad had made a crucial error. He'd underestimated Ruth Morrison, dismissing her as a harmless academic whose influence extended no further than her classroom. He was about to learn how dangerous truly intelligent people could be. 3 days of storms had been building toward this moment, and now nature's fury broke over Copper Gulch with biblical wrath. Rain fell in sheets that turned mining camp streets into rivers of red mud, while lightning split the sky like divine artillery. In the chaos of wind and water, 4 desperate people made their way toward final confrontation. Bodaway led through the deluge, Winchester wrapped in oilcloth, and his uncle's sacred bonnet secured beneath his coat. Behind him, Amelie struggled through ankle-deep mud that grabbed at boots and skirts, precious documents sewn into her dress, growing heavy but remaining secure. Dr. Morrison and Ruth brought up the rear, the physician having traded his medical bag for Walter's old Spencer rifle. The storm had transformed the landscape into something primordial and dangerous, where familiar landmarks disappeared behind walls of water, and familiar paths became treacherous rivers of mud and debris. But it also provided cover masking their approach, while forcing Conrad's sentries to seek shelter rather than maintain proper watches. The Copper Crown mine spread across the valley like a wound on Earth's surface, industrial workings scarring landscape in geometric patterns. Speaking of wealth extracted without regard for human cost. At its heart sat the company office Solid Stone, where Conrad conducted business converting blood into gold. The assault began at Conrad's Dam across Willow Creek, a massive timber crib structure filled with stone and clay, diverting precious water from downstream farmers to serve the mine's industrial appetite. The engineering was impressive, but illegal, built without territorial permits on land that belonged to the creek's natural watershed. Working in lightning-split darkness, Bodaway cut rope cables holding a massive log boom upstream. Storm-swollen creek did the rest, sending a battering ram of timber crashing into supports with artillery's roar. Guards never knew what killed them. One moment they huddled under makeshift shelters cursing weather. The next they scrambled for high ground as tons of water and debris swept their positions away. In the chaos, Amelie crawled along muddy banks, searching scattered equipment for additional evidence. Her numb hands found a leather portfolio dropped by fleeing guards. Inside were pay envelopes marked with initials and dates, payments for special services, signed in Conrad's own hand. The mine office sat on a rise above the creek windows, glowing yellow against storm-dark sky. As they approached, they could see figures inside Conrad himself, and at least 3 remaining men examining documents by lamplight. That's when Greasy Pete made his final desperate gambit. The explosion came without warning, brilliant flash turning night to day, and shockwaves rolling across the valley with enough force to shatter windows miles away. Pete had set dynamite in the tool shed, but storm-soaked fuses altered his timing. Instead of destroying the office, the blast ignited the hay storage facility. Within minutes, the entire complex was threatened by flames leaping structure to structure despite driving rain. "At the mine," Dr. Morrison shouted over Storm's fury. "They'll retreat to the tunnels." Conrad and his men were already abandoning the office for deeper passages where supplies and multiple exits would allow them to outlast pursuit or escape entirely. But Bodaway had anticipated this retreat, leading their party to intercept Conrad's group at the main shaft entrance. The confrontation was brief, but savage. Rattler, desperate with his wounded arm, tried blocking their path with a sawed-off shotgun. Dr. Morrison's Spencer spoke once the heavy bullet dropping the gunman face first into mud that quickly turned red. Inside, the mine water dripped from tunnel ceilings and pooled where storm fury had found every crack in ancient rock. Narrow passages echoed with footsteps and harsh breathing as Hunter became hunted in underground maze that Conrad knew better than anyone. But this was where Conrad revealed his true cunning. He didn't simply flee, he turned the mine itself into a weapon against his pursuers. Split up, Conrad ordered his remaining men. Use the ore car tracks to circle behind them. Drive them toward the flooded sections. The narrow gauge rails that snaked through the mine's depths carried loaded ore cars, pulled by mules or pushed by hand through the underground passages. And now they became Conrad's tactical advantage. The mine became a three-dimensional battlefield, where Conrad's intimate knowledge of every tunnel and shaft gave him deadly advantage. He sent one gunman through the ventilation system, while another used maintenance ladders to gain high ground. The third triggered a partial collapse in the main tunnel, cutting off retreat routes and forcing Bodaway's group deeper into the maze. He's hurting us, Bodaway realized as another passage revealed fresh cave-in blocking their way, pushing us toward the deep workings where the walls are weaker. Conrad's voice echoed through the mine's network of brass-speaking tubes, his words carrying through the system of acoustic chambers that connected his office to the underground workings. The brass pipes and speaking apparatus that allowed communication with workers in the deepest tunnels now served to taunt his pursuers from hidden positions. "Did you really think you could outwit me in my own domain?" His voice reverberated through the tunnels. "I've spent years learning every inch of these passages, every weakness in the rock, every place where a man might disappear forever." Dr. Morrison was limping now, his leg gashed by falling stone, when Conrad's men triggered the first collapse. Ruth stayed close to him, her teacher's mind working frantically to remember mine diagrams she'd seen in the school's geography books. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow shaft leading upward. "If that connects to the main level, we can circle back toward the entrance." But as they climbed the cramped passage, Conrad sprang his final trap. Water came roaring through hidden channels he'd opened with precisely placed charges, turning the shaft into a death trap as the mine's lower levels flooded with deliberate malice. "Climb," Bodaway shouted, pushing Amelie ahead of him as icy water rose around their ankles, then their knees, then their waists, with terrifying speed. They barely reached a wooden catwalk suspended above the main sump before the flood trapped them on a precarious platform over black water, whose depth was unknown, but whose promise was death to anyone unlucky enough to fall. Conrad stood at the catwalk's center, the satchel with Ruth's forged documents clutched in his hands and pale eyes reflecting their torchlight like a cornered animal's. Around him, his surviving men covered the platform's approaches with drawn weapons. "It's over," Dietrich Bodaway called, rifle trained on the mine owner's chest. "Come back with us and face what you've done." Conrad's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Face what the word of a savage and a French whore against a pillar of the community. You think any territorial court will believe your wild accusations?" "Maybe not," Amelie replied, stepping into torchlight with mud-stained skirts and fire in her green eyes. "But federal marshals will believe documented evidence, especially when it's written in your own handwriting." That's when Claude Brennan's true nature revealed itself. The deputy had been climbing through maintenance shafts, using his knowledge of the mine's layout to position himself behind Conrad's remaining gunmen. But he wasn't there to help his employer. He was there to settle a debt that went back years. "Hello, Conrad," Claude said, emerging from shadows with his service revolver trained on his former boss. "Been waiting a long time for this moment." Conrad's face went white as winter snow. "Claude, what you work for me, you fool, your debt." "My debt." Claude's voice carried years of suppressed rage, and suddenly his trembling hands were steady as stone. "You want to talk about debts, Conrad? Let's talk about my sister Mary." Remember, her pretty girl worked as a seamstress until she started asking questions about working conditions at your mine, until she threatened to report safety violations to territorial authorities. Understanding dawned in Conrad's pale eyes like terrible sunrise. That was years ago, an accident. Accident. Claude's gun hand was steady now, no longer trembling with fear, but rock solid with purpose. Funny how accidents happen to people who cross you. Mary fell down those mine stairs, broke her neck clean through. But I know she was pushed, Conrad. I've known for 3 years, been waiting for the right moment to prove it. The revelation transformed everything. Claude hadn't been working for Conrad out of simple debt. He'd been gathering evidence, waiting for his moment of revenge, while playing the role of corrupt deputy with consummate skill. The bank notices. Amelie breathed suddenly, understanding. They were fake. You were never in debt to Conrad. Borrowed money from my brother back east. Claude confirmed his eyes, never leaving Conrad's face. Took out loans I didn't need, created paper trails to make Conrad think he owned me. Been feeding information to federal authorities for months through coded telegraph messages. Claude's coded telegraph messages to federal authorities used the established commercial lines, each message carefully disguised as routine business correspondence, to avoid suspicion from Conrad's allies in the telegraph office. His voice gained strength as truth finally emerged. Every crooked deal, every bribed official, every suspicious death, I documented it all. Been building a case that would stand up in federal court, waiting for enough evidence to guarantee conviction. Conrad snarled with desperate fury, raising the satchel toward the black water. You're all too late without these documents. His words were cut short as the catwalk began to sway. Dr. Morrison, weakened by his injuries, had collapsed against the platform's supports. The structure groaned under shifting weight, aged wood creaking ominously over churning water below. The platform won't hold, Ruth shouted. Too much weight, too much damage from the flooding. That's when Bodaway made his choice. Instead of shooting Conrad, he holstered his rifle and grabbed the mine owner as the man lunged toward the platform's edge. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and desperate violence, rolling dangerously close to the catwalk's broken railing. Conrad was larger, but soft from years of comfortable living. Bodaway was lean muscle and bone hardened by seasons of survival on unforgiving land. The fight was brief, but savage, decided when Amelie's boot connected with Conrad's wrist as he tried to draw his concealed derringer. The weapon spun away into darkness, splashing into black water far below. Conrad followed it a moment later, not from violence, but from simple physics, as the overloaded catwalk finally gave way under too much stress and too much weight. But Dr. Morrison was ready. Even wounded, his physician's instincts refused to let any man drown. Working with Claude and Ruth, they managed to fish Conrad from the flooded sump before hypothermia finished what bullets hadn't started. The mine owner emerged, choking and gasping, his expensive suit ruined, and his pale eyes holding defeat, mixed with the kind of calculation that suggested his criminal mind was already planning new schemes. But Claude's final testimony would destroy any such hopes. There's something else the federal authorities need to know, he said, voice gaining strength as truth finally emerged. About Seganam's death. Conrad didn't just order it, he led the attack personally. Painted his face like a warrior to make it look like tribal warfare instead of calculated murder. The confession hung heavy in tunnel air, its implications staggering. Conrad Dietrich, pillar of territorial society, stood revealed as nothing more than a killer who disguised himself as the very people he claimed to civilize. I have evidence. Claude continued producing a wrapped bundle from inside his coat. followed Conrad to his meeting place the day before the attack caught him purchasing war paint and Indian clothing from a trader willing to ask no questions. Got a tintype portrait made while the paint was still fresh on his face, claiming it was for a theatrical production. He unwrapped a formal photographic plate. Also have receipts for payments made to known gunmen and this. He produced a beaded armband stained with dried paint. Found it snagged on brush near Seganam's camp. Same pattern as what he wore in the photograph. When Marshal Laurent arrived with dawn and Storm's End, he found prisoners secured and witnesses ready. The evidence was overwhelming: documents, testimony, photographic proof of crimes stretching back years. Conrad's empire crumbled like sand washing away in federal authorities' clear light. But for Baudouin and Amélie standing in gray morning light, with Seganam's bonnet wrapped respectfully in its sacred bag, victory was simpler and more profound. They had kept faith with the dead, while protecting the living, proving that truth would surface when people refused to accept that might made right. 2 months later, Willow Springs breathed easier under October's golden light. The illegal dam had been breached, sending life-giving water back to farms and gardens. The schoolhouse rang with children's laughter as Ruth taught expanded classes funded by legitimate mining income. Walter Kowalski had recovered enough to rebuild his barn, this one with proper fire safety funded by Conrad's seized assets. Dr. Morrison's clinic had acquired new equipment, surgical table medicines previously too expensive for frontier practice. The physician grumbled about federal paperwork, but was softened by satisfaction at finally having proper tools for his calling. More importantly, he'd established a miners' health program, ensuring that workers received proper medical care and that safety violations were reported immediately to territorial authorities. His frontier medical practice now had instruments and techniques common to territorial physicians: bone saws, laudanum for pain, carbolic acid for preventing infection, and the hard-won knowledge of treating gunshot wounds, mining accidents, and the various ailments that plagued frontier communities. But instead of treating preventable occupational injuries caused by Conrad's negligence, he could now focus on genuine medical care. The miners who came to his clinic no longer suffered from what he'd learned to diagnose as miners' consumption, what the old-timers called stonecutters' phthisis. The dust from poorly ventilated shafts that had destroyed their lungs was now properly controlled, and workers no longer had to choose between earning wages and preserving their health. It was in the reconstructed hay barn where their story began, that final threads came together on a crisp October evening. The building was different now. Proper foundations, glass windows letting in sunset gold, but it still smelled of hay and honest work. Amélie spread a blanket on clean straw as Baudouin arrived with travel pack and sacred parfleche bag. He'd spent the past month with his people attending councils where successful cooperation with white authorities was debated and participating in ceremonies honoring those who died for principles larger than survival. Ruth and Dr. Morrison waited inside along with Walter, and his boys recovered now from their ordeal and stronger for having survived it. But there was someone else present, a young man whose presence made Amélie catch her breath with recognition. Jules Rousseau stood near the eastern wall, perhaps 15 now, tall and lean with dark hair, catching lamplight and green eyes like their father's. He wore railroad workers' clothes, but carried himself with the dignity that honest labor provided. Amélie. His voice cracked slightly as boys' voices do approaching manhood. I'm Jules, your brother. The reunion was everything Amélie had dreamed during nights of fear and uncertainty. Jules had been at the Thunderhead Railroad camp when word reached him through Ruth's correspondence network, traveling to Willow Springs as soon as his work contract allowed. Papa talked about you, Amélie said through tears she'd held since receiving news of their father's death. Wondered where you'd gone, whether you were safe. I was angry. Jules admitted with honesty, marking him as Lucian's son. Angry at Mama for dying, at Papa for not saving her, at the world for being harder than a boy expected. But railroad work taught me that running from problems doesn't solve them. He pulled a letter from his pocket paper, worn from frequent handling. Got this from Papa just before he died. Told me about the mining partnership with Seganam, about the documents he was keeping, about how proud he was that his children had grown up to value justice over safety. But the evening's greatest surprise came when Ruth produced something from behind rebuilt grain storage. Not a tin lunch pail, but something far more meaningful. Amelie's music box from New Orleans, the ornate little treasure her father had mentioned with his dying breath. "I found this hidden in your father's cabin," Ruth explained. "Took me weeks to understand its significance, longer still to figure out how to open it without damaging the mechanism." The music box was even more beautiful than Amelie remembered mother-of-pearl inlays, catching lamplight, tiny figures dancing to clockwork precision. When Ruth wound the key, it played the old Creole lullaby that had haunted Amelie's dreams. Maman's song. She whispered, memory flooding back of evening rituals when Marie Rousseau would braid her daughter's hair while humming the gentle melody. She used to say it would keep me safe when she couldn't. The music box played a few notes of the hauntingly beautiful lullaby before revealing its secret. Inside the hidden compartment, wrapped in silk that had protected it from moisture and rough handling, was a document that completed their understanding of Lucien Rousseau's careful planning. A formal guardianship letter written in her father's precise hand and witnessed by Dr. Morrison, establishing legal arrangements for Amelie's protection. But more than that, detailed instructions for using Claim 27's resources to support not just his children, but the entire community that had shown them kindness. For water, for school, for the people who stay. Bodaway read aloud, his voice carrying prophecy's weight. Your father knew what kind of man my uncle was, knew he could be trusted with what mattered most. The letter was properly notarized, ink stamp clear, despite its hidden storage. It represented the final piece of legal evidence in a puzzle requiring months of dangerous investigation to complete. More importantly, it demonstrated friendship between two men from different worlds who'd found common ground in cooperation over conflict. But there was something else in the music box, a small photograph, sepia-toned and carefully preserved. It showed Lucien and Seganam standing together beside the entrance to Claim 27, both men smiling with genuine warmth despite the formal pose required by frontier photography. Uncle always spoke of your father with great respect, Bodaway said, studying the image. Said he was the first white man who understood that the earth belonged to everyone, not just those with papers claiming to own it. As night settled with crystalline autumn clarity, they sat together in lamplight's warm circle, sharing bread and stories and comfortable silence of people who'd survived terrible danger through mutual support. Jules spoke of railroad experiences, lessons about honest labor's dignity. Ruth described school expansion plans, possibly bringing additional teachers from Eastern institutions. Dr. Morrison dozed in his chair, exhausted by treating childhood ailments and continuing medical needs of people disrupted by Conrad's criminality. Walter's boys played quietly, building wooden block castles, while their father watched with grateful eyes that still showed traces of the fear they'd all lived through. At the circle's center, Amelie and Bodaway sat side by side, talking quietly of plans stretching beyond survival toward genuine prosperity, for everyone contributing to their legitimate mining partnership. The claim would be operated as Lucien and Seganam had envisioned, fairly safely, with profits shared among all workers and a portion set aside for community needs. There was no sudden romantic declaration, no passionate embrace under star-scattered skies belonging more to novels than real people. who'd learned that genuine affection grew through shared hardship and mutual respect rather than theatrical gestures. Instead, there was something more valuable, comfortable intimacy of shared purpose knowledge, that they'd chosen each other through actions rather than words, through courage demonstrated in genuine danger's crucible, rather than promises made in safety's moments. "You kept me alive when I had nothing but hope," Emily said as first snow began falling outside, dusting prairie in white that would deepen through months ahead. "You gave survival meaning beyond personal safety." Bodaway replied, his hand finding hers with naturalness, of two people who'd learned to trust each other with their lives. "You helped me honor my uncle's memory through building, rather than simply destroying those who wronged him." Outside, snow continued falling with gentle persistence, promising months of winter weather ahead. But inside the barn, surrounded by friends, become family through shared danger and mutual support, the future stretched bright, with possibilities neither could have imagined when their paths first crossed beside an overturned wagon, in circumstances that had seemed to promise only death and despair. The leather satchel sat empty on a nearby shelf, its secrets revealed and purpose served through federal justice finally delivered. But the bonds it had helped forge between white and Lakota, between strangers, become family between two hearts found amid chaos, those would endure long after snow melted and new grass grew green across prairie that had witnessed suffering and finally seen justice prevail. In spring, they would ride to Thunderhead together to help Jules collect his possessions and secure his position with the railroad's surveying crew. They would visit where Seganum died, not to mourn, but to honor a man whose vision of peaceful cooperation had been realized through efforts of those refusing to let his death be meaningless. And they would return to Willow Springs to life built one careful day at a time, founded on justice and mutual respect, rather than fear and corruption, that had nearly destroyed their community before federal law restored order and hope to people who'd almost forgotten what either meant. The eagle feather bonnet rested secure in its parfleche bag, no longer symbol of loss, but bridge between past and future, between traditional ways and new possibilities, that cooperation made available to everyone willing to work for something better than endless conflict. As lamplight burned low and conversation drifted toward peaceful silence, a people too grateful for safety to require constant talk, Emily thought she heard her father's voice on wind outside, speaking words from his final letter expressing hope for a future he wouldn't see. For the people who stay. They had stayed through fire and flood and human evil, testing every principle of civilized behavior. They had stayed when running would have been easier, when compromise safer, when surrender would have preserved lives at soul's cost. They had stayed, and in staying earned something more precious than gold, the right to call this harsh and beautiful land home. Knowing their children would inherit a world where justice was possible, and honor meant more than simple survival. Outside, snow continued falling, covering prairie in white, promising rest and renewal after seasons of violence and loss. Inside the barn, in lamplight's warm circle, the future was already beginning to grow, with seeds of slow patience planted in soil, enriched by martyrs' blood, and watered by tears of those refusing to let sacrifice be forgotten. The music box sat open on the blanket between them, its melody finally silenced, but its secret revealed at last. In morning, they would wind it again, letting Marie Rousseau's lullaby carry across the prairie like a blessing on all those who had chosen love over fear, justice over profit, and hope over despair, in a land that demanded nothing less than everything from those who dared to call it home. The music box's melody lingered in memory as autumn deepened into winter's embrace. But life in Willow Springs had found new rhythms built on foundations stronger than fear. By Christmas, the transformation was complete enough The traveling merchants remarked on the town's changed atmosphere. Children played freely in streets that had once echoed only with nervous whispers, and evening gatherings had returned to homes where lamplight no longer meant vulnerability, but welcome. Claude Brennan wore his deputy's badge with genuine pride, now having been officially reinstated by territorial authorities, who recognized the courage required for his long deception. His testimony had secured Conrad Dietrich's conviction on 17 federal charges, ensuring the mine owner would spend his remaining years in territorial prison, rather than plotting new schemes from comfortable exile. Justice moves slow. Claude told Amélie one snowy February morning as they watched federal surveyors establishing new boundary markers around Claim 27. But when it finally arrives, it tends to be thorough. The legal recognition of Lucien and Seganam's partnership had created something unprecedented in territorial law. A mining operation jointly owned by white and Lakota interests, with profits shared according to principles both men had died defending. More importantly, it had established precedent that tribal land rights must be respected in any legitimate business arrangement. Ruth Morrison's school had grown beyond anyone's expectations, drawing families from neighboring settlements who wanted their children educated in an environment where cooperation was taught alongside arithmetic and literature. Her correspondence with Eastern educational institutions had borne fruit in the form of additional teachers and a small but growing library that served the entire community. Dr. Morrison's medical practice had evolved into something approaching a proper hospital with Claude's help in securing federal funding for frontier health care. The physician took particular satisfaction in treating former miners whose lung ailments had been ignored under Conrad's regime, finally able to provide care without fear of economic retaliation. But it was the spring wedding that truly marked the beginning of new life for all of them. The ceremony took place in the meadow, where Claim 27 bordered Willow Creek, with Reverend Matthews performing services that honored both Christian and Lakota traditions. Bodaway wore traditional dress-beaded shirt and leggings his uncle had worn for important occasions, while Amélie's dress was her mother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit with Ruth's expert seamstress skills. Jules gave his sister away, with the grave dignity of someone who'd learned responsibility early, having returned from railroad work with plans to study engineering, so he could help develop the mining operation according to his father's vision of sustainable prosperity. Walter Kowalski played violin music that drifted across prairie grass, where his boys ran with children whose laughter had been absent too long from frontier life. The Polish farmer had become unofficial spokesman for a cooperative association that now managed several small claims according to principles Lucien and Seganam had pioneered. As evening settled and celebration continued around carefully tended fires, Bodaway and Amélie found themselves alone beside the creek, where her father's claim began, and his partnership with Seganam had first taken root. The music box sat between them, on a quilt Ruth had sewn as wedding gift, its mother-of-pearl surface catching starlight. "My uncle would have loved this day," Bodaway said, watching fireflies dance above moving water. Seeing his dream of cooperation bearing fruit, seeing his people and yours finding common ground. Amélie wound the tiny key, releasing the Creole lullaby into night air that carried the scent of sage and prairie roses. Papa used to say that some songs were too beautiful to keep to yourself, that they were meant to be shared until everyone who heard them felt a little less alone. The melody played out its gentle cadence, then faded into comfortable silence filled with cricket song and distant laughter. They sat together in the growing darkness, two people who'd found each other through circumstances that might have destroyed weaker souls, but had instead forged something precious and enduring. In the years that followed, their story would be told and retold around frontier fires, becoming legend that spoke to possibilities beyond simple survival. But for Bodaway and Amélie, Sitting beside flowing water under stars that had witnessed their struggle and triumph, the future was not legend, but living reality built one careful choice at a time. The music box sat open between them, its secret finally revealed its melody, finally shared with those who understood that some treasures were worth any sacrifice to preserve. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, mining operations to oversee children, to raise communities to build. But tonight belonged to gratitude for dangers survived and love discovered in the most unlikely circumstances. As midnight approached and celebration sounds faded into contented quiet, they finally rose to join the others. The music box closed with a soft click, its treasures secure, but no longer hidden its melody ready to play again whenever hope needed reminding. That even in the harshest frontier, justice and love could triumph over those who believed might made right. The prairie stretched endlessly around them, no longer seeming empty, but full of infinite possibility for those brave enough to plant seeds of cooperation in soil others had tried to poison with fear and greed. Behind them lay the abandoned mine shafts, where Conrad's empire had crumbled. Ahead lay the lights of Willow Springs, where their children would grow up, knowing that courage and conscience could overcome any evil, no matter how powerful it seemed. In the music box's perfect mechanism, wound by loving hands and set to play, whenever darkness threatened to overwhelm hope, lay the true treasure. Lucien Rousseau had died protecting not gold or silver or legal documents, but the simple truth that some things were worth preserving at any cost, and that love, once discovered, could illuminate even the deepest darkness with light that would never fade.